And someone said to me, this is true. The difference between a cult and a good community is what happens when you try to leave. That's kind of a good marker of a cult. If you are allowed to leave and everyone said wishes you well and pats you on the back, then it's a pretty healthy community. If, however, you're prevented from leaving, sometimes physically, you're stopped, or if you're shunned or excommunicated when you do leave, that's the sign of an unhealthy group.
Hello, Clint. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Astra. I'm really looking forward to doing this.
Likewise, likewise. I like that we had a conversation last week, decided to do this, and here we are today
Yes.
having a conversation.
Yeah, it was really good.
So before we go into more of your story background, things like that, I have a question that I always ask everybody coming on, which is, what is something that at some point felt impossible for you and now is your new normal?
It's funny because I spent so many years in church ministry, so I would have never seen myself out of that, sort of world. But now I'm sure we'll get into it. I've left the Christian faith many years ago. I'm now a devoted sort of agnostic atheist. I would have never seen that. That would have been impossible to contemplate, 20, 30 years ago. No way, no chance.
How does it feel like, in some ways, now having that impossible your reality? Because it's a complete shift of reality.
It is. It really is. It's a total shift. And that's the funny thing about when someone leaves a religion or a cult or a high control group behind, you have to completely rebuild your authentic identity or discover it, really. In some cases, I think in my case, I was born into Christianity in the United States. I live in the UK now, in England or North Wales. And, I would have never ever questioned it. And yet this is who I am now. So that's the new reality. I feel like I'm discovering, rebuilding, reconstructing, whatever you want to call it, the true Clint, the person who was trapped underneath all those layers of religion before.
So, okay, so there's a few questions that I have there. So first of all, what made you to question it or start that journey on? I think the first step really is that questioning.
Hmm. Yes, it was, in my case, a very long process, what we call deconstructing, basically questioning your inherited belief system, your worldview, your theology, what you believe about God, the Bible, in the case of Christianity. But it took years and years and years. There was a lot of doubts along the way. And I read a really good book a few years ago by someone named Dr. Marlene Winnell. And I would recommend this book for people who grew up in fundamentalist Christian Bible groups and cults and churches, real high control sort of environments. It's called Leaving the Fold. And she said something that really startled me. She said, anytime you had doubts or questions about what you were taught, what you believed about God, the Bible, whatever, that was actually your authentic self trying to poke its head above and say, above the parapet and say, hey, something doesn't add up here. That's actually your real true self. But you end up squashing that down and suppressing that self in favor of the religious self. It's almost like there's two selves operating at the same time, your true self and then the religious self. So it's really hard to break through that. But I feel like that's finally what I did. The true self asserted itself, and it's like, this is actually who I am.
What was the breakthrough process? Because I think it's easier said than done,
Oh,
especially when
absolutely.
all of it's part of your identity. It's all you know.
Yeah, especially if you were raised in it, and that's kind of the thing. If you step back a little bit and zoom out, when you talk about religious groups, churches, religions, cults, and all that, there's kind of broadly speaking, two sorts of people. There's people like me who were born into it, so we never knew anything different. I was literally raised in Seattle, Washington, in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, raised in a Christian family, born into it. I was a baby, literally. I think I was a week old, and I was already in church. My mother was holding me in her lap in the church pew. I was in church from literally almost day one. I never knew any different. Then there's another kind of person that becomes, let's say, a Christian later in life. So they had a previous existence. And so for them, if they leave the faith, their journey is a bit different than mine, the people who were born into it like me. So you kind of, it's a case by case thing. You have to take it on an individual basis, I think.
With living, the question that I have there is, to your point, like it was in your family, so it's not like you now live in isolation. Like,
Yeah,
what was the family's? How did you navigate the family, their reaction? Was there any reaction?
yeah, there was. And this is unfortunately all too common in groups like that. You end up getting shunned or excommunicated. There's a lot of different language in different cults, labeled some sort of a, like in Scientology, a suppressive person or an SP. You're an apostate if you're a Jehovah's Witness. There's a lot of different labels for it. Someone who's lost the faith or lost their belief system. In my case, though, it was a combination of some things that went on in my family. I had to end up cutting off the relationship with my mother, and I talk about this in my book at the very end. I don't want to give it all away, but I ended up having to do that because she was so toxic and so
Can you give
damaging.
the book title as well?
Yeah, so I wrote a book last September. It's on Amazon. It's called Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People: How Bill Gothard Church and Family Taught Me Christianity Doesn't Work. So if people want to have a look at that, it's on Amazon. But yeah, it's a long process, and unfortunately for a lot of people, yeah, they end up getting excommunicated or shunned, and they lose that community. They lose the friends and family that they had.
Which, in many ways, it feels like religion should be about coming together and support and, all that.
How
What would be
ironic.
your comment there, especially as somebody who has, in some ways, you have been on the inside and on the outside, which is really a unique perspective that you can have because you're not just like one sided. You have had like much broader perspective of it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the irony of the whole thing, as you just pointed out. Like in the case of Christianity, which is the religion that I'm most familiar with, it promises so much. And when you come into it, I was just writing about this today on my lunch break at work. I'm trying to work on my sequel to Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People, picking up the story of where it left off, talking about deconstructing and everything. And it's really difficult because you go, how does this thing add up? It actually can't deliver on the promises that it makes at the beginning. But the thing about churches, for particular example, they have this sort of inbuilt community. It's built into the DNA of the very organization. So when you come in the front door for the first time, let's say you're visiting the church down the street, around the corner from your house or wherever you live, you're loved, you're welcomed. It seems amazing, and it is, and you feel like, I really want to be a part of this thing. But then no one tells you about the back end. Oh, you might get shunned if you question your beliefs and deconstruct and walk away. We'll turn our backs on you. No one ever says that.
How do you Okay, so I'm thinking about the cult because as I were talking, I was thinking. I think I heard somewhere that um, it's not the religion, it's the people that is
Mm,
kind of like making it bad. Um, I don't know that much about religion, anything, but I would want to assume that it has good intentions. It's just that a lot of times we as humans we add the human factor to it, and that's
mm-hmm,
where things can sometimes go sideways. But as you were speaking, I was thinking like, what's the difference between, or like, what is it that makes a cult a cult? What I
mm,
mean by that is, so you said about like questioning things. It's like, okay, if I would assume or like guess that if it's a cult, you're not allowed to question things. But if it's, let's say, instead community, you should be able to question things, to not even to get answers that are straight up, but maybe have question back that helps you to kind of continue exploring. Because I think a lot of times when we try to fit something in a box, it's, first of all, we're so unique as people individually. So it's like if you now have to fit in a box which is not authentically your box, it won't work for you. Something will
mm-hmm.
feel off or you will be miserable. Um, so I think that it's kind of like the thought process that I'm going through right now as you're speaking, of like what is the cult? How do you know that it's called? Because I also had like I listened to an episode on your podcast where there was somebody who had really good experience with like being religious.
Mm-hmm.
So that I don't want to get somebody listening and now they come after us and be like,
Yeah.
that's not how it is. That's not my experience, which is valid.
Exactly.
So it can be both positive and negative, and that's where I think it's less of the religion than maybe the people
Mm.
that make those like negative experiences.
Yes, there's a lot to unpack there. One thing that I'm reminded of as you were speaking, one person explained it to me. He said, basically, it's like, when you go to the dentist, let's say, or you break your arm and you have to go to the hospital, they're going to have to do an x-ray of your arm or the broken bone. that's accepted. You need to have that X-ray. However, you are exposing yourself to harmful rays, harmful X-rays. But a little bit of a dose isn't going to hurt you. It's not going to kill you. It's not going to give you cancer. However, if you have a huge amount of dosage, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to have health problems. You're going to have other issues. And that's what he said. Like religion, it's on a spectrum. Cults and religion, some are less
Mm.
harmful than others. Some are really super damaging to the point where, like in the case of Jonestown in 1979 down in Guyana, almost 1,000 people either committed suicide or ended up getting murdered following Jim Jones. That's the most
Can you
extreme
share the
example.
story behind it?
Yeah, it's kind of a long story, but Jim Jones, he was a very charismatic person, and that's what you're going back to your definition of a cult. Typically, a version of a cult is you have a very charismatic leader around whom gathers a group of people, and usually a he, but there are female cult leaders out there, but it's pretty rare. Usually, it's a man, and this charismatic leader sort of gathers a group of people around him with this vision. He's like a messianic vision of something, whether it's enlightenment or whatever you're going to achieve, your potential. You can put in so many people like L. Ron Hubbard of Scientology or Keith Raniere of Nexium. There's so many cult leaders, Jim Jones of Jonestown. And he was a preacher in the Midwest in the United States back I want to go back as far as I think even the late 50s, early 60s. Ended up traveling to California with this group of people that had gathered around him. They kind of formed a commune in the San Francisco area, but then they bought land down in South America on the north coast of what's French Guiana and built this commune called Jonestown. And in the end, though, he became so paranoid and so far out that he convinced his followers to kill themselves by drinking basically what people call it drinking the Kool-Aid, drinking this poison punch, basically. And almost 1,000 people ended up killing themselves. Some were shot by his sort of guards, but it was a murder suicide thing. It was the biggest mass suicide in certainly American history, cult history, and that really shocked a lot of people because it was like people remember the footage of the helicopters flying over this, and you see just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bodies laid out all over the ground, and they're all dead. They've committed suicide. So that's one of the most extreme examples of what can happen in a cult.
What, as you're talking about this, I'm thinking, what makes a person impressionable? Because there might be people listening. There was interesting a social study that I watched. There was a video on pretty much like the end result was to teach somebody, not teach somebody, but get somebody to the point where they push somebody off the building.
Yeah.
And what they would do is they had consistent things that they were doing to guide that person to make that decision, and they were explaining everything like psychology behind it. And there were people at the end that ended up pushing the person off the building, where afterwards they were like interviewed, they had conversation, and they were like, I would have never thought I would have done that. And I think it's easy to look from the outside in and judge people for like following the cults and be like, how could you not know? How could you not notice it? Or like not realize this or that? Um, Maybe you can speak from your experience or things that you have learned, because I'm sure you're really deep into this whole thing.
Yeah.
Um, like what was like your experience, or what have you learned about it when it comes to like how impressionable people are, or the power of the cult of people actually like following it?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think I've talked to many cult experts, sociologists and cult experts over the years on my podcast, interviewed people, and I've always asked kind of a similar question. What kind of a person gets drawn into a cult? Is it the common misconception is that, stupid people, gullible people, fools who get drawn in and, they don't know any better and they just get sucked in. The truth is, though, that that's not the case. It's actually they appeal to your vulnerabilities, and some of the most well-educated, bright, smartest people can get sucked into a cult. I mean, the example I mentioned, Keith Raniere, there was a cult in the United States called Nexium, and it was a shocking thing. He ended up branding these women. I don't know if you've seen some of the documentaries, but he branded his initials on their upper thigh, like right in their sort of crotch region, with a branding iron. And this
Wow.
was the extreme to which these women went to. They were like sex slaves, basically. And yet this guy was pulling in incredibly talented, smart people who were trying to take their career to another level. And that was this sort of human potential movement. And that's the way it tends to work, is that cults are very good at pulling in vulnerable people. Like my friend Chris Shelton, he was an ex-Scientologist, and we've talked about this a lot. If you're walking down the street, someone comes up to you out of the blue on the sidewalk and says, "Hey, would you like to take a free personality test? Find out more about yourself and get to know yourself. That sounds really great. We've got this free thing. Come around, in here with me, and it's wonderful and it's great. Everyone's friendly and it's really helpful. You talk about yourself, you talk about your own problems and issues. It's like free counseling." And that's how they get you. Before you know it, you're sucked into Scientology, and it's all this sort of system that pulls people in. But they never tell you about the crazy stuff they believe. You don't find that out till years and years later, till you're so far in you can't get out. And someone said to me, this is true. The difference between a cult and a good community is what happens when you try to leave. That's kind of a good
Mm.
marker of a cult. If you are allowed to leave and everyone said wishes you well and pats you on the back, then it's a pretty healthy community. If, however, you're prevented from leaving, sometimes physically, you're stopped, or if you're shunned or excommunicated when you do leave, that's the sign of an unhealthy group.
I think this goes even like beyond cults, because I think a lot of times, even like when it comes to growth development, you will outgrow people in your life,
Sure.
especially people that you find important, or that they have played big or like important role in your life. I have had experiences with that where like I start to outgrow people, and not that it's a bad thing. There's nothing bad about it, but we just have less and less in common, and that's where like it's been an interesting experience to go through that, because and I have worked with some people that go through something similar, because you get to the place, um I like to call it the no man's land, where like
Mm-hmm.
you're not at the new group yet, you're you don't align with this group, and you're somewhere in the middle, and at the same time you haven't reached that potential, or that to the fit for this next group. And a lot of times what people do, because this is familiar, they go back to the old like ways, which is hard to navigate, not just with like cult is like an extreme example, but in general in life, like it's hard to advance when you're by yourself and go through that lonely or like lonely period.
Mm-hmm.
um Question there would be like, have you gone through that yourself, even with your experiences? And do you have any advice for people that maybe now are going through that no man's land
Sure.
period?
And that's the thing. I think I was just writing about this today at lunch, that we all need community. We need relationships. It's not good to be in isolation, is it? And be a hermit on the mountain somewhere, living by yourself for the rest of your life in a cave or something. Some people do that, I guess, but it's not necessarily the healthiest way to go. But I think for people that have left whatever community it might be, not necessarily religion, like you say, just a group of friends, you're out there wandering as a nomad, you need to find a new tribe. And that's where you need to, I think, plug into a healthy community that does stretch you, challenge you. And that's the thing, like I said, the hallmark of a good healthy community is that you grow and you learn and you change, and you have an influence on other people and they have an influence on you, and it's a healthy back and forth. When it's just you being controlled, that's the hallmark of an unhealthy community for sure.
So going into your restructuring your identity,
Hmm.
how was that? How is that? What's the journey been?
That's the long journey. It's still happening now, decades later. I look at it as sort of like, I don't know if you've heard of Dr. Robert J. Lifton, but
No.
he wrote a book called Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. And
Okay.
he was all about, he was a psychologist, he was an army doctor back after the Korean War. And he interviewed a lot of Korean War veterans, soldiers, and civilians alike, who had spent time as prisoners of war in communist Chinese prison camps. And they were, brainwashed, for lack of a better word. He was one of the ones that kind of coined that phrase, and he did a whole study on that. How does it work? How does it actually happen? Because people in the West were quite concerned that, if they could do that to our soldiers, what else could they do? They can control the population and all that. Now, Dr. Robert J. Lifton talks about this concept of doubling, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, where if you're in a religion, let's say, your authentic self gets suppressed it doubles in favor of this religious self, and you kind of wear the mask to fit in. And that's what I did. I can see that now. Of course, at the time, I thought I was doing all the right things. Being a super religious person, I was a pastor, I was a Bible college teacher, I was teaching other people. I did that for 20 years, spent all my life in ministry of some sort or another. But once I left it all behind and I did away with that religious self, that wasn't really me. Now it's a case of, okay, who is the real Clint? I've got to find this person in there somewhere, so that's the journey. That's the hard part, is sort of like rediscovering or discovering who you actually are and becoming the person you should be, that you want to be.
That's it's a tough journey. I don't want to say tough, but it's definitely not short. And
Mm,
it's something that I talk a lot about, how I think even the moment that we think that we know ourselves, we stop our growth. Because now you think
mm.
like, well, I know I'm like this, I'm like that. But there's so many layers to us. There's so much that you can learn about yourself. Even when you think you know yourself, oh, I'm sure I don't like this. Are you sure? Did you actually try that? Like, did you actually do it? Or you just had one bad experience? And it's something that I have also been on that journey of, even like my journey with running. I was like, I'm not a runner, I'm terrible at running. And then I started to question it, and I was like, says who? It, like, did I
Mm,
actually try? Did I actually try and go and run long distances? I didn't.
mm.
So
Yeah, don't knock it till
does
you've
it
tried
mean
it.
it's still, yeah? And because what I have learned is that if we think that things are true, and we don't question them, which goes back to your point about questioning things,
Mm-hmm.
if you don't question things and you set them as they are, you're pretty much like stagnant. Nothing is changing, nothing is improving. But then when you start to question things, which is where curiosity comes in, of, okay, I it probably sounds much, it's much later explained than, oh, I'm curious who I am. It's more like, I have no idea who I am, what I stand for.
Yeah.
You kind of go through some kind of identity crisis, especially
Mm-hmm.
when you grew up and you spend big part of your life thinking that, okay, this is who I am, like, that's who I am. I dedicate my whole life to this thing. And now once you're out, it's like,
Yeah, what now?
and is that a waste of my life?
Mm,
Is, do
yeah.
you have any like regrets?
Oh yeah. I mean, like I said, I spent so much money going to Bible college, seminary, doing a PhD, all these years and years and years in academics and in ministry. And now, in a way, I have nothing to show for it on paper. You could say I have a PhD. Luckily for me, I teach carpentry and joinery at colleges here in the UK. The first job I started at, they paid for all my teaching qualifications. That was far more valuable to me than my PhD. I made more money, because I did my teaching qualifications. But the one thing about it is you can pull out positive things even from your time in, let's say in my case, in ministry. Okay, was it a complete waste of time? No. I learned, I love teaching. I love teaching other people. Even when I was teaching the Bible, it was still the same process. I learned how to play the drums to play in Christian rock and heavy metal bands. I don't play in
Nice.
Christian heavy metal bands anymore, but I still play the drums. That is a talent, that a skill that I learned when I was a Christian. It didn't stop the minute I stopped believing in God. I didn't forget how to play the drums, so I have that passion. And my girlfriend said to me the other day, I was talking about this one learner that I had. She came in, she was having a terrible day. I could tell something was wrong. We're talking about a 16-year-old girl having a really terrible day. I tried to help her, helped her do a joinery exercise. She did phenomenally well, and I kept telling her, look how good you're doing. You're doing this perfectly, and everyone else is struggling. And anyway, she went away, and I saw her later in the corridor just before she was going to go home, and I said, yours was the best one of the whole group today. And she said, no, no. I said, no, listen, I'm not being funny. Yours was the best one. And she went home with this huge smile on her face. And then I actually ran into her mom yesterday at work, and she told me that based on what happened in that conversation, she was going to quit college. And she said, not only am I going to stay, I'm going to do level 2 joinery next year. And I told her mom about that conversation. She said, well, I think it had something to do with what you told her. So I told this story to my girlfriend. She said, all those years you spent as a pastor, those skills, those people skills, those pastoral skills are still there. That's who I am. I didn't have any religious aspect to what I told this learner, but the principles are the same. So you can pull positives out of those experiences. It's made me the person that I am, and I'm becoming all those years, working in the church and all that.
I think it also might be, by the sound of it, that your authentic self was shining through, even like
Mm-hmm.
through those experiences. Like you do
Yeah.
like to teach, and you learn that maybe that's not what you want to teach, so you can teach something else.
Yeah.
This the skills still can be transferable. Same
Absolutely.
thing with music. So I think even like, because I think I have had many people that I talk to or like work with where they're not, let's say now they're in front of seemingly big decision for them, and before they have even made decision they already think about regrets,
Mm.
and which is reasonable, because what we do a lot of times, we make this decision and now instead of focusing on making it right, we look back and we're like, what if that one was better? We don't actually
Yeah.
like go all in that decision, or we don't even trust ourselves. And even if we down the line learn that this might not have been the right decision for me right now with where I'm at, it doesn't mean that it's a waste of time,
Mm.
because you still learn things, you still go through experiences, you meet people, there's so much that comes from that. But I think it's so easy to look back and and it's so funny, before we have even made a decision we already have regrets about potential
Yeah.
things that might not happen with the other decision.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where a lot of the times we hold ourselves back from going into certain experiences, even
Yeah.
like with you leaving the religion. um Even with that, it's like there's a lot that you leave behind. Even though it maybe looking back, it's like, okay, yeah, all of this, not all of this, but a lot of it might have not been good for me, or like doesn't authentically align with me. But there's still, as you go through that, emotionally it's like a turmoil. It's
Mm-hmm.
not like, okay, no feel no,
Yeah.
like I feel
That's over
nothing.
now.
I
Let's
think
move
that
on.
now is, yeah, it's like I'm ready to go. It's like
Yeah.
no looking back. And
Not so
it
much.
yeah, and I think that's where it's easier said than done. And that's what I always try to remind people, that as we talk about these things, like I had like 2 episodes, or like a few episodes, I don't know when this one is coming out, ago, Rodney Lawson on the podcast, and we talked about like he pretty much like he skimmed like in like 30 seconds walked through 7 years of like
Mm.
hard, like a lot of going through like challenges. And I was like, let's go back to that, because you said it in 30 seconds, but it's 7 years.
Yeah. 30 seconds.
It's, yeah, it's just like, oh, so that's, and then a lot of times when people listen, they now think that, okay, something's wrong with my journey, because I don't feel that like, oh, I was there, now I'm here only like a few days later, or whatever it might be the timeline. So do you have any advice with navigating those periods? Because those, regardless of what are your beliefs, regardless of what are the like people that you follow or things like that, you will go through that. It's inevitable in life. You will go through those periods when you do feel that like you're not sure about the decision, even if it feels right, but there's still a lot that goes behind the scenes, and you don't feel ready yet. It's so unfamiliar. Do you have any advice there?
Mm. Yes, it's difficult, like you say, to make decisions and not, overthink it. I think sometimes I tend to overthink things, but I think this is the value of having people in your life that they are not afraid to tell you the truth, but they do it. They do it because they love you and they have your best interests at heart. That's why, going back to our earlier point, you need community. You need healthy community in your life. So when my girlfriend kind of pulls me up and calls me on something that I'm doing, I might not want to hear it, but she's saying it, I know, not just to tear me down and belittle me and make me feel terrible. She's doing it because she cares about me and she wants to help me become a different person, a better person, and all that. And we have these long conversations about what's going on in her life and my life, and we try to help each other and support each other and build each other up, which is what a healthy relationship's supposed to be. You're not tearing each other down. And I think we need that because it's difficult. You can easily get out of balance, I think, if you're just out there, like you're saying, wandering as a nomad. You need the perspectives of other people. You need those points of view. We don't always want to hear them, but they can be very, very helpful in our own development, our own journey.
It's actually something I was thinking about the other day. I'm probably gonna make a video on it, where I was thinking about mentors. And I think the way I would describe it is that a lot of times we have this path that we're on, but once in a while we get off track. And if we don't have mentors that can quickly get us back on, we start to do this, and then it takes so long to then get back on. And then once we get back on, another distraction, and we get off. But if we have consistently people in our lives that can help us to stay on the track, because we all have doubts, we all question like, oh, maybe that other thing is better, maybe this is better, maybe that is better, because
Mm.
everything seems better
Than what
until
I'm doing
you
right now.
see it up close.
Yeah.
And you're really deep into it, and you're like, oh, okay, maybe it's not that good. Or even like with, I think good example is relationships. We all think that, oh, that person probably will be better, that will be better, and then once you really get to know somebody closely, you see that we all are humans. None of us are perfect. And we will have bad days or bad mood, or all this, and we will have different opinions on things that are not aligned, and we both want to be right. So it's like you will go through those situations. But it's and I like what you said about the support, because I think support also is important, where support in a way where it's not about one person now trying to make the other person do what they think is the best for them, but more so helping them to try to understand or navigate or even get answers for themselves. Like, what is it that I think is the best for me? Instead of, I think this is the best thing for you to do based on what I think or what I believe,
Mm. What I
that
want you
not
to do.
always, yeah,
Not
that
always
might
your
not
best
always
interest.
align. Yeah.
It's
So
true.
that's also important to keep in mind when it comes to support, because it's and even with trust or creating safe space, which sadly, the more I think about it, the more I feel that it's rare nowadays. Even
Mm.
though I literally had a conversation with this the other day with somebody about how it's so, in some ways, ridiculous how, and I have been thinking about this because I have been like first safe space for a lot of people to get some like really bad or like traumatic things outside of them. And I was thinking, why is it that they decided to share it with me? Like genuinely being like curious, like what was about the way I was like sitting, my face, or the questions. I don't know what it was. And there's few things that I have understood. Like, one is they don't want. A lot of times, what we do is we make the person feel judged.
Mm.
So the moment they feel judged, that's it. Like, you're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
It's not
You're
safe.
not helping them.
Yeah, and also approaching it with curiosity instead of judgment. So once you're curious, and I have done a lot of thinking on this, what you do is you gather information. Once you
Mm.
have information, then you can judge it. But by the time you have gathered information, you have better understanding of the situation, so you can see different perspectives,
Yeah.
not just your own. Of, I think that's not right, I think that's not good. You actually see the person's perspective, and you're like, oh, okay, I understand why you think this way,
Mm.
and I can understand it. This is my perspective,
Yeah.
and I'm not forcing it on you. This is just like my perspective about this situation or whatever is the topic that we're
Yeah.
talking about. And then the second thing I think that I have realized is the care. They actually want to feel like you care for them and you have their best interest at heart. Because, also to your point about relationships and even friendships, which I'm learning a lot about friendships as well. It's not about saying what the other person wants to hear.
Mm.
It's a lot of times saying what they need to hear,
Yeah.
which a lot of times we don't want to hear.
No,
Um,
we don't.
and it can damage a lot of relationships if we
Yeah.
don't understand that it's all about the intention. If the person is telling you something that you don't want to hear, but you know that they really care for you and it's for your good that they're saying that, and they're literally at some point they risk losing you as a friend because they don't know how you might react. That's how much they care.
Mm.
That's where you can unlock really deep, strong like relationships, friendships, um, and also your own development, growth, and connection with yourself, because that's where you learn so much about yourself when you have somebody calling you out and being like, listen, you said you gonna do this or that, or we actually like you're not doing that. Let's keep you accountable here. And it doesn't feel good. I have had plenty of people call me out and it doesn't
Yeah.
feel good.
Same here.
But
We don't
it's really
appreciate it at
powerful.
the time, but yeah, if you can, and part of that is how do you receive that, isn't it? If rather than being
Yeah.
defensive and angry, I was thinking too while you were talking about these, perspective is a big thing, isn't it? Because the last couple of years, it's been a really stressful few years for me. I was teaching carpentry at a prison to inmates for about a year and a half, and I was kind of forced out of the job. It was super stressful. There was some really toxic dynamics going on, I ended up leaving the job. I wasn't planning on quitting, but I kind of had to leave. And then I went back to working on the tools. I'm a carpenter by trade. I thought, you know what? I'll just go back to building and doing that kind of thing. So for the last year, I've been working for a company. We do like custom wardrobes and closets and sliding closets and all that. Now, I thought it would be an absolute dawdle, as they say here, just a piece of piss, easy job. It was not. It's physically very difficult, very demanding, a lot of super long hours, working until 7 or 8 o'clock at night, getting home late, super late. You can make decent money, but it's very grueling and tiring. Now, recently, I've just switched jobs going back to teaching. I just had a call out of the blue from a recruitment agent saying, "Do you want to get back into teaching?" And I said, "You know what? Yeah." But if I hadn't had that year of doing something completely different, I now appreciate this new job a lot more. Having a job where you get off at 5 o'clock, where you have paid holidays, where you've got, if you get sick, you're not losing money and you've got time to do things, and there's no stress and it's not crazy physically difficult, like the other job was. But if I hadn't had that perspective, I wouldn't see that, now. So, even the things that we go through, we don't always understand why they're happening at the time, but sometimes a couple of years later, or maybe not ever, but sometimes we do go, all right, I think I understand, some of this, and I understand myself a little bit better because I love teaching and I love the idea of getting back into teaching, which is something I sorely missed because I was basically working by myself all day. Just put the music on and just get on with the job, but I was missing that teaching aspect of my authentic self. So I get to do that again, which is really exciting.
Actually, what you said, it's really good example of how the more you're being curious, the more you explore, the more you can actually put things in perspective,
Mm-hmm.
because you are expanding that view of, okay, this is this compared to this or compared to that. So you keep building that like perspective, more in some ways like educated or like more quality, instead of, okay, this is all I know, I'm just gonna stick to that and that's
Yeah.
my perspective kind of thing. Okay, so last question before I'm gonna ask last question on your podcast. Once you're gonna go there, what are some of the things that you have learned about yourself through the, not just a journey in the most recent years, but also with like growing up?
I think that's it. And the connection between what I'm kind of exploring at the moment, this idea of spirituality. I think for a lot of people like myself who come out of religion, the second you even use the word spirituality, we can get triggered. And I'm sure we can talk about that when we get to my show in a few minutes here. But I've learned, this is something I learned from, I had this woman called Lauren Axelrod. She was on my podcast right at the end of 2024. And she said something that really kind of hit me hard. She said, there's some kind of a link between depression, even maybe physical problems. If people aren't doing what they know they love to do and they're good at and they enjoy, and they know they should be doing that and they're not doing it, it does affect us. So like going back to my example of working for the last year back on the tools. Okay, I love building things, but I love teaching more. And I was really unhappy that I wasn't able to do what I love to do, and reconnecting with that. Now I'm going to interpret that as some kind of a spirituality thing. I'm not saying God, the Bible, Jesus. I'm just saying it's a connection, the deep spiritual connection. When you do the things you love to do and you enjoy doing them and you're in that flow, you're in that moment, there's something really profound. And I've learned that over the last, several years, that I need to embrace those times. Like when I'm playing music, I get a feeling that's just a profound feeling that I love. And I tend to savor those moments. I think to myself, okay, this is the moment you need to sit here and just savor it when we're playing a song, because it's unlike anything else, because I'm doing what I love to do and everyone else in the band is doing what they love to do, and it's a wonderful feeling. So I'm going to say that's some sort of spirituality. I don't know what that means, but that's kind of how I'm seeing it more and more now.
Yeah, and it's, I think it's a part of the journey as well.
Yeah.
um, well, thank you for coming on. I know we're going to continue this conversation, and I'll ask you the last question, which anybody listening, if you want to hear what's the impossible that Clint is chasing now, click the link below so that you can go to the second part of this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really excited about that. So you're going to be my guest. I get to interview you for the Dismantling Doctrine podcast. So yeah, people want to hear part two. head over there and they can catch this great conversation.